São Paulo today has 20 million people. It is larger than New York City, Los Angeles, or Ciudad de Mexico. It's the beating heart of the Brazilian economy. Our stock exchange is there, most of our industry is there, most of our service sectors are there. It's the most important cultural city in Brazil. It is tied down with Rio, but I would say that in the last few decades it has become more important than Rio, but that's another time, another argument. For all intents and purposes, it's the biggest city in the Americas. So it's hard to imagine it with all its people, buildings, industry, that it was ever any different. But at some point it was. So where does it start? And when does it start? Well, for that we have to first understand a few things, geography, then history. We need that context because history does not exist on a vacuum, nor does a city. Let's start with geography. If you look at a map, São Paulo sits near the coast, but it does not touch it, and that's crucial. Actually, São Paulo is 3,000 feet above the main sea level. If you zoom in, the city is in the middle of a huge valley. Of course, given not a big valley in elevation terms, but it's a valley. So if you continue the highways to the coast, eventually you will reach São Vicente and Santos. That's where the history begins. History. Portugal. The Portuguese arrived in Brazil in the 22nd of April 1500, in a trip bound to India. It's often cited as a mistake that they were bound to India and they found Brazil. It wasn't a mistake, it was exactly as intended. They planned to come to Brazil and sound the region for future profits. They knew there was land here, because first there was the Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494, and then they also spoke with the Spanish. They knew there was something here, or else there would be no treaty. But in this first trip, no settlement was made. They, however, remarked the presence of Brazil wood, which was very valuable in its trade for its red amber color. At this time, the Portuguese were not that interested in settling the region. The first settlement was just founded in 1532, more than 3 decades after they arrived here, in the island of São Vicente, near São Paulo, near Santos today. And it's important to point out the Brazilian colonial entity at this time. Much like the US, it was made of several different colonies, or herdoms, as an allusion to their form of ownership. Technically, they would be hereditary captainships, but that's the best I can do, herdoms. They were public-private enterprises owned by noblemen from Portugal. That's different from the United States. They were not companies in itself, they were technically passed on generation above generation for a family, for a nobleman's family. It wasn't technically a company, as we would see with the Dutch or with the English. And very few of those herdoms actually succeeded. Most noblemen never set foot in the Americas, so consequently most of them did not sustain itself. One exception, one of the few exceptions on both issues is São Vicente. Its governor actually coming to manage the colony, and the colony of which actually sustained itself. And speaking of sustaining itself, economy. At first, and most times, the only commercially viable product in Brazil was Brazil wood. That's how our country got our name. It's very labor intensive, and Portugal did not have the population to explore it. Unlike England that sent a lot of its people to America, Brazil did not have that luxury. So since the very beginning, the Brazil wood cycle relied on slavery. And at this first instance, it was not the African slavery that we have come to know in the next centuries, but indigenous slavery. Portugal organized a lot of expeditions to the interior of the country to find indigenous peoples and enslave them. Brazil, like the Americas, was not empty. Around 5 million indigenous people lived here in 1500, most of them in the coast, but not all of them. We have new information in the past few years that does corroborate that fact. The Portuguese, they brought diseases, they created tensions with their slavery methods, and they allied themselves with a few tribes from the coast. That's important. The rival tribes of those tribes, they allied themselves with the French, who were keen on making a colony in Brazil at that time. The Spanish were also here at some capacity, and both the Portuguese and the Spanish, they had one thing in common, the Jesuits. At this time, the Catholic Church, only a few years after the Protestant Reformation, was keen on making new Christians in the New World. The Jesuits found the first catechizing missions in Brazil, and one of the first was São Paulo de Piratininga, where our story actually begins. The tensions between the Portuguese and the Jesuits were never null, and they would remain high until the 18th century. The Jesuits in the colony of São Vicente down on the coast were looking for another place to catechize the indigenous without the influence of the white man. And yes, that was the actual term used at the time, the white man, the Portuguese. So São Paulo, the place where it is right now, was a favorable place. In the interior, enough removed from the Portuguese influence, but close enough to them so the place will not be isolated. And that's important. There are a lot of stories of cities that were founded by the Portuguese, the Spanish, or even the French that were just forgotten. Sometimes they would spend 15 years without a single news from the colony, from the city that was founded. Sometimes that city was actually forgotten for a long time until eventually in the 19th or 20th century it was rediscovered. And that was an actual fear of the people founding new cities in this time. Going back to São Paulo, on a straight map it makes 70 kilometers or 45 miles, not a huge distance to the coast. But the elevation of 3,000 feet or 1,000 meters, due to the huge outcrop that is just outside of the coastal plain, made it a longer voyage than the actual distance made it to be believed. That elevation, with those 70 kilometers and the jungle that was there and is still there today, made it a lot harder than just going straight to the city. It was much harder, and there were a few trails that would go from one place to the other, but most of the times those trails were not larger than a man's width, so it wasn't very accessible. The place where São Paulo is today was also a confluence of 5 indigenous trails, one of them being the Piabiru, which ran all the way to Cusco in Peru. Even before 1500 there was trade between the Atlantic coast and the Pacific coast of the Americas. And we just found that trail a few years ago. We had writings of that trail, we had registers, a lot of people spoke about it, but we just found the actual remnants of that trail a few years ago. The place where São Paulo is also offered much more temperate climate than the coast, and a few of the rivers that sprung up there were navigable, not navigable to seafaring vessels, but they were navigable enough to actually go to the Paraguay Basin and the La Plata Basin, so you would take a boat in that river in São Paulo and you could go all the way down the Paraguay and the Uruguay until you found the La Plata Basin. So it was an important place of trade even before the Portuguese arrived. And the temperate climate, it was very important because of mosquitoes. So we have dengue, chikungunya, we have malaria. So the less mosquitoes you had, the less outbreaks you would have. So it was also important, that specific thing, because of the temperate climate. Of course, it's not like Europe, but it's much more temperate than the coast. Founding proper. After the Iguape War, which was a war between the Portuguese, the Spanish, and a few of the tribes, near the place where the Tordesilhas Treaty used to cut off, the governor Martim Afonso de Souza incentivized the settlement of other places outside of the coastal plain. That was a huge issue back then in the Iguape War, which happened in 1530-32. And at this time, one Portuguese man used to live in the plateau above the Serra do Mar. His name was João Ramalho. He was much of a character. The priest Manuel da Nóbrega, which we will soon know more about, would write about him a few years later. He walks 90 kilometers a day and has no white hairs. At this point, he was already an old man. João would found a small reduction we know today as Santo André da Borda do Campo in 1550. That city I will talk more about in the latter part of the video. In 29th of August 1553, the priest Manuel da Nóbrega and other Jesuits converted 50 indigenous people to the Catholic faith, set to found a village in the plateau region then known as Piratininga, which is where São Paulo is today. The choice was not just to escape the Portuguese direct influence, but a choice of hunger. Most of the food eaten at the coast was brought back from the plateau above. The region of the coast was not that productive. So the Jesuits set to make an astral map of the city, yes, I'm very serious about it, with its position, time of founding, and other telluric measurements. Well, if that worked, well, the result is undeniable, 20 million people later. To go from the coast to the plateau, João Ramalho would help the Jesuits go over the hills in January 1554, where they started setting up a few buildings. The first buildings were more of shelters than buildings. They were made from crude wood and tree branches. In the 25th of January, the day of the conversion of St. Paul, they celebrated the first Mass of the settlement, and found officially São Paulo de Piratininga. The place chosen to be settled was a hilly outcrop in the plains from the plateau. It was kind of exactly in the middle of the plain. Today we refer it as the historical triangle. It's a loose triangle shape that the city took a long while to extend beyond, and it is the historical center of the city to this day. In one side there lies the Tamanduateí River, the other the Anhangabaú, and the other the Tietê. There the first stone buildings were started. The first one the church, the second the Jesuit college. I would say college here, but it's not like Harvard. It's more like of a place where the Jesuits would not only catechise the Indians, but they would also give some formal education, much more akin to a primary education today. Both started in 1556, the Stone Church and the Stone College. The Stone College is still there to this day. Actually, it's the Pátio do Colégio. It's very central to the city. You can actually go there and see it. So the city does not exist on a vacuum, just like history does not exist. So there were a few tribes nearby. Some people from some tribes were converted by the Jesuits and settled in the city. And there was a very different modus operandi from the Portuguese and the Jesuits. When we are talking about the Jesuits, you can actually say that many people that came to the Jesuits, they were not forced to go there. The Jesuits were much more benevolent, even though they were not that much benevolent than the Portuguese. And then they first started agriculture, finally. The first crops were cultivated, and it was much manioc and corn. Just after a few years, did a few of the Europeans started planting wheat, which does need a colder climate that they did not have in the coast, but they fortunately had back there. And more people arrived. Remember that guy, João Ramalho? So in 1560, the governor, Mem de Sá, he ordered the people from the city that he founded, Santo André da Borda do Campo, to migrate definitively to São Paulo. And that's important because that city, Santo André da Borda do Campo, we have lost forever. Technically, most probably we have the city of Santo André today, where it was, but we have never found the ruins of that city. We have never found that archaeological site. Probably it has been built over because the city does extend all the way to the hills from the valley, so we have lost it, basically. Fun fact, in 1850 there was a rendition of the ruins in watercolor, but it's hard to verify if the ruins are true or not because we have never found it again. So when the people from Santo André they arrive at São Paulo, the settlement is elevated to the status of village for the first time. So it was actually recognized as a village. And it didn't have much people, most probably it wouldn't cut from 1,000 people, but it was one of the few villages that were in the interior of the country, up in the plateau. So it was important. And even though it was a small village, in 1562 war eventually came to it. The Tamoio Confederation, a loose conglomerate of various tribes which were rival to the Tupinambás, who were allied to the Portuguese, attacked the city of São Paulo. And behind all of that, one of the firestokers of the conflict was the French. Yes, the French, who were allied with those tribes and were trying to make the Antarctic France in Brazil. Many of the guns and arms that the attackers used were provided by the French. The attacking forces arrived at the 9th of July 1562 and encircled the whole city. One of the leaders defending the city still was Tibiriçá, who was the leader of the Tupiniquim tribe that used to live in the Piratininga region, and whose daughters would marry important Portuguese people in the village. The Tamoios arrived that morning, chanting Jucaí Caraíba, which means death to the Portuguese. They were all painted and feathered as the tradition was for the indigenous. One of the people attacking the village was Tibiriçá's brother, Piquerubi, whose village was set in the eastern side of São Paulo today, around São Miguel Paulista. The attackers breached the defense lines during the day, and the man leading the charge was Jaguaranho, who was the father of Tibiriçá and Piquerubi. He charged to the stone church, first of all, poised to kill all the Portuguese priests. But when Jaguaranho arrives at the church door, an arrow strikes him in the belly, killing him instantly. And his death makes the charging attackers call back the attack, fully demoralized without their leader. The village defenders would eventually be successful the next day. The Tamoios would retreat and Tibiriçá would kill his own brother. The city would survive its first battle. In 1590 the city would again prepare for battle, but this time the fight would not come. But the tensions would eventually de-escalate in the next century, allowing for the colonies to finally start developing the region. Because most of the colonies, if not all, started with virtually nothing. Few were those who arrived with small possessions. There was no capital to enterprise. Many were seduced to the migration to the New World in a similar way to being expelled from Europe. The poor, the unlucky, the outcasts. And in the end it would be those people who would mark the beginning of the city. Those in the edge of society, settling to what was for them the edge of the world. The colonists from Europe eventually would marry the indigenous and produce descendants, and those descendants we would come to know as the Bandeirantes, the subject of my next video. So thank you so much for staying until here. This is a personal project of mine and I really appreciate it. Until next time, bye.